General Naram Sin surveyed the battlefield with apprehension and a creeping feeling of helplessness. Tasked with halting the advance of the Roskill on the capital of the Keshi home world by the order of the Galactic Coalition's Grand Council, he commanded a coalition grand army of 500,000 soldiers, a contingent from every member of the coalition, a tradition for centuries. An army of this size had not been gathered in over 200 galactic years, and he expected to overwhelm the Roskill into surrendering or flight, but they hadn't been that accommodating. The Roskill had appeared on the border of coalition space about 2 galactic years ago, claiming friendship and trade. They said one of their probes came across a derelict exploration ship that had suffered catastrophic decompression after something pierced their hull, possibly an asteroid storm. None of the crew survived, but the computer core was intact, allowing them to determine the ship's origin. They wanted to return the bodies of the crew, but the ship was too damaged and broke up while being towed to a station. This gesture led to the coalition welcoming them with open arms, most of them, anyway. The humans were reserved in their dealings with the Roskill, but the council assumed it was because the humans only recently joined the coalition and didn't know any better. Many grand councilors brushed aside their concerns without listening, thinking they were jealous of the trade deals the newcomers were making, especially in markets the humans had yet to gain access to. Eventually, the humans gave up on their attempts to advise caution in dealings with the Roskill. It was 6 months ago when they found out the humans were right not to trust them. The Roskill Armada crossed the border into Tatau space, devastating their home world and several colony worlds. There were few survivors, and those who did reported outages in subspace communication and power grids. It became obvious that they were sabotaged by the Roskill. All their claims of wanting peaceful trade were just an excuse to scout coalition defenses and future targets. 4 systems fell before the sluggish coalition military tried to fight back. Having been at peace for over a century, their navies were better suited to fight pirates than full-size warships. The humans tried to warn them again, but they weren't as technologically advanced as the rest of the coalition forces, so what did they know? Even after a Roskill fleet attacked a human colony world, but was driven off by a smaller human fleet, they called it luck and a diversion on the Roskill's part. The coalition lost every engagement against the Roskill in space and on the ground. Over the last several decades of peace, their military had become what the humans dismissively called a parade ground army. Human officers would say they looked good during ceremonies, but their training was woefully inadequate and far too reliant on advanced technology. Once again, the coalition military high command ignored their advice, thinking humans still used projectile weapons and didn't know anything. The invasion of the Keshi homeworld finally convinced the high command to invite the humans to fight with them. Rumors spread that it was only because they needed the numbers. They were told to only send a contingent, not their whole military, to assist. The humans shrugged and sent a single division of 50,000 soldiers and support units, making them practically self-sufficient with their own heavy weapons, transports, medical units, and more. The largest fleet the Grand Coalition had assembled in centuries set out for Keshi and dropped out of FTL to find a Roskill fleet already in orbit. Troop transports began to make planetfall while the warships engaged the Roskill. The human warships, on the far right end of the battle line, drove into the Roskill flank before they were fully deployed. The Roskill knew what would happen if they stayed after the humans broke their far left and started to lap around behind the others, so they disengaged and fled. The fleet admiral thought they'd fled from his superior numbers, and the humans didn't waste time correcting him. General Naram Sin watched his army disembark with satisfaction. Decked out in their gleaming body armor, they marched off the ships in step, lined up in neat rows, and presented their pulse rifles just like on the parade ground before the high command. Except the humans, their body armor was a dull green, and several of them trotted off in different directions. Others helped unload their equipment of archaic weapons. Their weapons fired small projectiles via chemical propulsion. There were vehicles with long tubes sticking out the top, called self-propelled guns, and they had a variety of other weapons, even knives. How primitive they were. General Naram Sin had no idea what to do with them, so he left them to guard the landing ships. The human officer seemed annoyed but saluted and told his troops to dig in. The humans began digging holes around the ships, but the general didn't understand why. Were they going to hide from the enemy? How cowardly of them. Once all his troops had disembarked, he formed them into a column and went out to find the enemy, minus the humans, of course. They looked impressive in their shining body armor and perfectly ordered columns. The Roskill would take one look at his vast numbers and run away. He was sure of it. He took no effort to send out scouts on his flanks. He didn't need them since his hand scanners would suffice. His sensors finally found the enemy army, which wasn't even a quarter of the size of his. He deployed his troops into a battle line and marched to meet the enemy. His army finally caught sight of the hated Roskill. The Roskill fired a few shots before turning and running away. General Naram Sin laughed when he saw them run away. He knew it, but they wouldn't get away. He ordered his army to chase them, and being the fastest race in the army, ordered the Norcan contingent to catch them and pin them down until the rest of the army caught up. With the Norcan sprinting ahead, he ordered his troops into 4 columns and followed at double quick. He smiled at the idea of his quick victory, but in the blink of an eye, everything changed. They just passed where they first saw the Roskill lined up when the fleeing enemy turned around and opened fire on the Norcans chasing them. It was like they ran into a buzzsaw, and hundreds went down, caught by surprise. His army stopped their pursuit, and then the other shoe dropped. Roskill soldiers popped up out of their hiding spots and sent a fusillade of shots into both flanks of his army. Their energy weapons pierced his troops' armor with ease. They'd barely begun to return fire when the ground erupted around them. The Roskill set off hidden explosive charges they placed underground. This was the last straw for the untested army, and it shattered into its component pieces. It was every contingent for themselves. General Naram Sin managed to keep his people's contingent of Shwan troops, along with 3 other races together, leaving him with a quarter of the troops he started with. All the others panicked and ran. The Roskill gleefully shot them down in great numbers. The general hoped his group could retreat and escape in good order during the chaos, but there were far more Roskill than he imagined, with shots from behind telling him they were almost surrounded. He tried to call for help but got only static. The Roskill were probably jamming his communication channels. Not knowing what else to do, he ordered his troops to take cover in the blast holes created by the explosions. The only saving grace for his reduced command was that there were so many fleeing coalition soldiers that not all the Roskill fire was directed at them, but his troops were slowly being whittled down by the accurate Roskill fire. Their heavier weapons made a terrifying thunderclap when fired, its psychological impact almost more dangerous than the energy bolts they fired. He could see the increasing panic on the faces of the troops he had left. General Naram Sin said a silent prayer to his ancestors, preparing himself for the end. He didn't even notice the new sounds on the battlefield, a series of pops, cracks, and other noises he couldn't describe. A moment later, he heard a whistling noise followed by a huge boom from the massive fountains of dirt tossed up in the air by artillery fire. He peeked over the edge of the hole he was in to see hundreds of humans firing into the startled Roskill. He was amazed as he watched them move forward, with one group of humans running forward and flopping to the ground while firing at the Roskill, another group running past them to take cover, and then firing at the enemy. They kept this up until they nearly reached the Roskill position. Their dull armor made them harder to see, and only a few were hit by the pitiful Roskill return fire. General Naram Sin enjoyed the screams and wailing coming from the Roskill as the humans attacked from several directions. The Roskill were used to having their way in their fights with the coalition. Caught completely by surprise, they had no idea how to respond. They made a critical error in a combat situation and were left with only 2 options: flee or die in place. Those who hesitated were lost as more and more humans reached the battlefield. It took less than a quarter hour to finish off the last of the Roskill. Human medics began to scour the field for those wounded they could still save. A human approached General Naram Sin, saluted in their fashion, and identified himself as Colonel Sirs of the Terran Marines. General Naram Sin returned the salute with a huge sense of relief and thanked the colonel with effusive praise. "So one of my messages got through?" he asked. "Messages? We didn't get any messages," the colonel replied. "How did you know to come here and save us?" a confused General Naram Sin asked. "Our commander saw some of the fleeing troops heading for the dropships and thought something went wrong," the colonel replied. "So he dispatched my command to link up with you. Which officer told you how to find us?" "It might balance out his fleeing," the general angrily asked. "Sir," the colonel asked, looking confused. "Oh, no one, sir. No one. Then how did you know where to find us?" "The Roskill had jammed all my communication channels, and I couldn't broadcast our location," an increasingly confused General Naram Sin asked. The colonel smiled and replied, "An old Terran military maxim, sir." In the absence of any other orders, always march to the sound of the guns, the general mulled it over for a second before replying. "It seems you humans know more about war than I assumed." Addressing the colonel, he continued, "Well, Colonel, I think I need to look into this more. So, take me to your leader at this." Several nearby humans broke into laughter. The colonel silenced them but couldn't completely hide his amusement as he said, "Yes, sir." If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. For every comment that says we will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.